This is Scott Spears, and recently the National Examiner ran a story, the headline, Celeste Holm's Nightmare, in which it was reported that Miss Holm's sons are in a squabble with her 48-year-old husband, Frank Basile, and that she has no money and may lose her home at age 94. Joining us, her husband, Frank Basile. Frank, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Frank, when I read this and saw this, I saw it in a tabloid, and I thought, boy, I hope that can't be right. And then I read the story in the New York Times, and I thought, uh-oh, looks like it is right. Tell us what has happened here.
First of all, you can't believe everything you read, and anybody who doesn't understand that, including myself, has a lot to learn. I mean, we want to be optimistic and believe everybody has the best intentions, but people are trying to sell papers. That's one thing, and if they can twist it and take an angle that suits their need, that's what they do. I want to clear something up. First of all, I never read the National Enquirer or whatever that tabloid was, so I can't comment from personal experience. The New York Times did, and I was aware of that article, and we participated in that article. And even they took journalistic liberties and didn't check their facts and completely conveyed some wrong facts that we clearly gave them the truth in our interview. In fact, they could have checked on the internet by any other sources, so a number of sources. So let me clarify some things right from the beginning. This was not, the case in the court was not a case between Celeste's children and myself. They may have been motivated, the children, by their feelings towards me. But the case in the court was not a dispute between the children and me. It was the case that was presented and had to be brought before the court was a case that Celeste brought before the court after a year and a half of efforts failed to reason with her children and try to get them to return what they took from her fraudulently. They took control of her home. They took control of her money. They infantilized her by deceiving her and telling her that everything they were doing was for tax purposes and leaving her to believe that she actually still had control. Now, she and I were in a three-year relationship when this was happening. And when I started reading some of the signals and bringing it to her attention that some things didn't add up, the kids were saying, we started to look closer into what they did. And it turned out that they took all this control, and it turned out to be an enlightenment to Celeste, a very troubling truth. And when we started to talk to them about correcting the situation, the kids actually threatened that they had the ability, and Celeste would have to be removed from her home of 55 years at the time, that she was going to have to be removed from her home and move out within 2 years. Now, that conversation took place 9 years ago, and we're still in her home. But they actually said that Celeste would have to move out of her house within 2 years, and then they, after a year of trying to reason with them, they actually revealed their true motives, and they said their problem was with me, and that's why they did what they did. So we continued to try to reason with them, and when they showed no effort and no good faith to try to fix the situation, then they started to use the control that they now had to refuse to pay Celeste's living expenses for her home and her monthly and daily expenses. They started to refuse to use her trust money to pay her expenses. They were withholding and denying her rights to live comfortably in the way she had been living. And that's why the lawsuit was started by Celeste. court to start to use her trust money, first of all, to pay her bills and stop infantilizing her, and also to return the control that they took. And that case was filed to the courts by Celeste, had nothing to do with me.
Now, Frank, I have two questions coming out of that. Celeste being a very well-known movie star and also a multimillionaire.
Well, that's perception.
Perception. Well, when this started, when they originally took control, wasn't Celeste represented by some kind of attorney that would have been looking out for her best interest?
Well, that's a good point, Scott. She had an attorney when she was married for 35 years to another actor called Wesley Addy, and they had an attorney of 35 years, and the attorney had an accountant that was in the family. They were a father and son. And this father and son team had represented Celeste and her late husband successfully. As soon as the late husband passed away, her son stepped in and started to get involved more in Celeste's financial affairs. Now, there's question as to whether he was really invited in by Celeste. He's claiming that his mother was never really good in finances, so he, to me on the side 9 years ago, he basically indicated he took charge. In the courts, he made it sound like Celeste asked him in and needed his help, and relied on him exclusively. This is all posturing on his part as part of his defense. It's not necessarily the truth, but nonetheless, he came into the case, or he came into her affairs, and the first thing he did was convince his mother that a relationship of 35 years was no longer in her best interest. And he had her sign papers that released the attorney and the accountant. And it's interesting that the reason that he stated in the letter that Celeste was releasing these two was that she, according to him, had discovered that they had positioned themselves in her estate to have more control than she wanted anyone to have. Now, that very statement alone contradicts what her son did later down the road. But nonetheless, her son manipulated these two out of the picture. Then Celeste hired a new attorney. And that attorney, after meeting with Celeste over a period of weeks, drafted an estate plan for Celeste and sent her a big folder. And the very first page of that folder outlines his agenda for her. And the first line on that agenda says, for Celeste to maintain control over her assets during the course of her lifetime. So this attorney got the picture as to what Celeste wanted to do, and he proceeded to do that. And he did so by planning her estate in limited partnerships. He did the taxable savings for her estate, but he made sure that she was in touch of all those, she was in control of those limited partnerships. And he did draft it to where her son had managerial positions in those limited partnerships, but Celeste always maintained the veto power, the ownership of these limited partnerships. So this attorney was honoring Celeste's wishes. Then, after 2.5 years that she was working with this attorney, and I happened to be in her life during this 2.5 years, because we met in 1999 and we started a relationship in the year 2000. And this estate planning actually started sometime in 1998 and ended somewhere in 2001, 2002 with this second attorney. Then all of a sudden her son told his mother, Mom, this attorney is not moving fast enough. We need to fire him. We need to let him go as well. So he had her sign a piece of paper, and he sent it to the attorney, and now she's no longer working with this new attorney, or this second attorney group. And in replacing him, her son hired a third attorney, convinced his mother that this attorney was working for her, and unfortunately, though, Dan, her son, and his wife, and his children, and everybody met with this attorney over the course of 5 months. And Celeste never met the attorney once until 2 weeks before this trust was drafted, and everything that she worked her entire life for had been taken from her. So the attorney, who supposedly was claiming Celeste was his client, hadn't even met his client, hadn't even talked to her on the phone, had no contact with her whatsoever during the first 5 months of him being hired. And he was taking all of his instructions from her son and his family, who, when we started the court case, in discovery, we got the emails. The one that was in the New York Times was quoted in the New York Times, which showed that 3 months before or 4 months before this trust was even drafted and Celeste lost her control, the son went to the attorney and said, "How do we keep Mr. Basile out of my mother's estate, even if they were to get married?" Those were not incentives. Those did not represent Celeste's wishes or Celeste's feelings. I mean, for goodness sakes, we were in a relationship for 3.5 years. A loving, nurturing, respectful, trusting relationship. And so, was the attorney working for her? Only in theory, by him saying she was my client. But in practice, he violated his ethics. He violated the law. He committed malpractice. He committed attorney-client. There's all sorts of things he committed, and he was representing the children. And and they were able to get away with this by getting an attorney who could do their bidding.
I guess the common question that would come to mind is when the second attorney was let go, the one who was acting in Celeste's best interest, why did she sign that paper? And when she finally met for the trust, why did she sign that paper?
Well, that's a good question, too. I mean, and it's a reasonable question. You've got to remember something here. A parent who's at the time, she was 80 years old. Well, at the time, no, she was 84, going on 85. Yeah, she was 85. When you're 85 years old and you love your children, you want to trust your children, and that was the first incentive. That he says, "Mom, the guy's not working fast enough. You hired me. You want me to manage your affairs. I can't work with this guy." So she trusted his opinion. So that's why she let him go, the first attorney, or the second attorney. But she never thought that the agenda had been changed. There's many attorneys can be hired and fired as long as they're going to do what you want them to do. Her son never indicated that he was changing the structure or the goal of what the attorney was doing, just that the attorney wasn't getting it done. And Celeste, had only been working with him for 2.5 years, and really kind of a distance. It's not like he lived around the corner and was her best friend. So, she didn't have a lot invested in him. She liked him, thought he was a nice guy, but if he wasn't doing the job, she trusted her son, and she believed her son. So she let him go. The second question, the second part of that question is much different, okay? Because at the time the third attorney came to the apartment, Celeste had actually experienced a complete hip replacement only 8 weeks earlier. Okay, Scott? When you're 85 years old and you have a total hip replacement, the second of 2 total hip replacements, she was in in-house rehabilitation, lying in bed for 6 weeks with a 24-hour nurse. And it was during this time that the attorney actually showed up to go through all of the extensive paperwork. And Celeste was on painkillers, antibiotics. There were multiple levels of things going on top of the recovery from the hip replacement. She had been suffering from short-term memory loss for about 11 months, or actually a year and a half. But she had been on a drug called Aricept for 11 months. Now, anybody who knows what Aricept is, or anybody who's dealing with elderly people losing their memory, Celeste has not clinically been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And there was a tabloid that I read in the UK who said that she had Alzheimer's, and that was a lie. That's slanderous, quite frankly, because Celeste Holm does not have Alzheimer's. It has not been clinically diagnosed. She has, though, short-term memory problems. before she was asked to review these papers and sign them, she had been put on Aricept for this memory problem. And all of these drugs have side effects. They make you tired. They make you lethargic. And quite frankly, at the time that the lawyers came around with her son and an accountant to review these papers and go through them with her, she was tired. She hardly asked any questions. She didn't even talk. She was literally just trying to hang in there, listen for the hour and a half. She was practically falling asleep. I wasn't in the room, but I know this because this is this is the way she was behaving in other situations other than that. And subsequently, since then, long, laborious, detailed discussions, she got tired. And she was fatigued, and she was being, she was on the mend from this hip replacement. And it was certainly not the right time to come around and expect her to make some of the most important decisions in her life. And it was easy for her, and it was easy for her to trust her son. Because one thing she told me, I questioned what her son was doing. I told her, I think he's taking your control. And she said to me, he's not taking my control. She said, I have my control, but he's going to manage it, but this is just a temporary situation. They're planning it for tax purposes. And she says, if I want to change anything, all I have to do is ask. I can change it at any time. My son said, all I have to do is ask, and I can change it. And Scott, that made her believe that she still had control. But what her son hadn't really told her was, I have the authority to say no to you. Does that make sense to you?
That does. I guess another question that would come to mind would be, years later now, Celeste is 94 years old, and it seems like every article that's been written or talked about talks about her memory in some degree. At 94 years old, what is the memory like?
Well, when she's healthy, she is absolutely in the moment. Celeste is funny, articulate. She still sings. She can still perform. She still enjoys an audience and can be enjoyed. We have great times. But her short-term memory, is if you ask her what happened yesterday, it might be there. If you say, do you remember this? Then she'll say, oh yeah, and by the way, what happened? I mean, she can contribute to it. But you might have to just give her a start, Her long-term memory is there. It's just, some of it's gone. It's just, a little bit comes and goes. But she's in the moment. She's, we went through a series of tests, and they said this is a very high-functioning, brilliant mind that has lost a certain amount of the executive decision-making skills. And that's based on the ability to retain multiple complexities at the same time. And that's diminished, and to be expected in anybody. But she's certainly fun. She's certainly still deserving to enjoy life. And she's deeply, deeply bothered by the ugliness of this whole situation, and sometimes when she forgets it, it's a blessing. And that's one of the reasons I try, when she's going through getting better, I try to buffer her from this stuff, because it's very painful to her to realize and be reminded and discover all over again that she was lied to and stolen from her children. So every time she's confronted with that reality, it's like living it all over again. And that's hard.
Frank,
and that's been really hard on me as a husband, to keep her from that kind of angst and hurt. But unfortunately, she has to be her own advocate at times in a lawsuit. And the less that she's been able to be her own advocate, I've had to step up and articulate what she's told me and remember what she's told me over the years. And the more I have to do that, then all of a sudden it sounds like I'm putting words in people. It's my fight instead of hers. You know what I mean?
I can understand that.
That's been the frustrating part.
Frank, what is the current money situation in the home of Celeste Holm right now? I mean, is there a danger of losing the home? What are you living off of? Has she had to cut back on certain things? What's that situation?
Absolutely had to cut back on a lot of things. And and she shouldn't have had to. She was not living extravagantly. Listen, I was born to a father who worked was in the military for 20 years. I worked my entire life. I understand the principle and the concept of hard work, and I've never been a freeloader in my entire life. I think my wife and I share a lot of traditional values. I must say this: I know in my heart that I'll stand before God someday, and right now I am exactly where she needs me to be, where I need to be, and I think she and I are a blessing to one another from God. What she requires on a daily basis, no offense, but a man twice my age, if he had fallen in love with this extraordinary woman and they started a relationship, he wouldn't have been able to step up and provide the needs that she really requires. And when we first met and we first fell in love and started our relationship, it was a cakewalk. She didn't require anything. I mean, she was going and doing a TV series, and I was singing opera and traveling, and we would meet in the middle and enjoy this wonderful relationship that we started. But when she had the congestive heart failure, it required me to say, okay, what's more important here, being on the road or being with her? And I didn't want to lose her. I didn't want to read in the paper, Celeste Holm died last night. And I wasn't there to help or be there to comfort her. And I don't want, it's just one of those horrible thoughts that you just want to avoid. So we made some practical decisions. But when I started to spend more time with her, we wanted to protect the dignity of our relationship and her personal dignity. So we had a helper come in, and we had an aide. Well, we can't afford that anymore because of the sacrifices we've had to make just to keep her in her home. Her children wanted her to sell her home and move out just 4 months ago. After there was a signed settlement a year and a half ago, they were still trying to get her to agree to sell her apartment and move out. And I felt that it was more detrimental to her to move out. It would be more traumatic. So I figured let's use her pension and Social Security to pay the co-op fee, which is what the trust is responsible for paying, but the trust no longer has any money in it to pay. So we're using our Social Security and pension to pay the co-op. And before, we used to use that Social Security and pension to pay for an aide on a monthly basis. Well, I'm doing that 24/7 now.
Where did the money in the trust go?
That's a good question. One of the trust, when the trust was formed, it had approximately $2 million in invested assets, not including the apartment, and liquid assets. The son, who was responsible for providing to his mother every year an accounting since she was a co-trustee, refused to do this to her, refused to give her an accountant. Even at the request of all the lawyers, he continued to refuse to provide an accounting. When the court stepped in and actually took the position that they were going to really try to force a settlement, regardless of the issues of fact, regardless of the injustice against Celeste Holm, the judge is another problem in this case, and because the judge has a history of never trying any case, but only forcing them to settle. There's a whole problem in the court systems when this can happen, and a person really can't get their day in court. And it should be a lesson to a lot of people. But in the meantime, when the judge actually said, I'm going to settle this thing, then we finally got an accounting 8 years after the fact, or 7 years after the fact. And in the accounting, it showed that he had borrowed money from the trust after there was a lawsuit even started to buy a house in Florida. Now that is a direct violation of his responsibility as a trustee. And to get him to sign the trust, I assume, was the only incentive I could understand as to why the judge would do this. But the judge so ordered that he and his children could keep these loans that they took from the trust and consider them gifts. So there's over $500,000 of the trust that went to that. Okay? Then some of the money certainly went to paying Celeste bills every month, because when her son stopped paying the bills, and we had to file the initial lawsuit because he had stopped paying the bills. There was about 11. It turned out to be, I guess, almost 8 months to 9 months of bills that had not gotten paid. That the court said, start paying these bills. So, and she was allotted up up to a certain amount each month of her bills to be paid from the trust. So a lot of the money went to paying that, and it started to eat into the principal of the trust. Some of the money went to the fact that the son used the trust money to pay for his legal fees and take care of a farm in New Jersey that they also took away from Celeste against her knowledge. And they were using her money to carry their responsibilities for the tax and maintenance and things like this on a farm that she no longer owned. They used the money in the trust to pay dividends on an insurance policy on Celeste's life that was already paid up. So it was a self-sustaining policy where the annuities generated each year was enough to pay the monthly the annual dividends, or the annual requirements for the life insurance policy. Let me see if I can get that straight. The life insurance policy requires each year, a payment of $25,000. It was not the life insurance policy was, although it was on Celeste's life, it wasn't. Celeste was not the benefactor of that life insurance policy. Her two children were, and they owned the life insurance policy. So as a result, when the life insurance policy was paid up, and the life insurance policy generated every year enough of an annuity to pay the dividend, that they no longer had to pay that $25,000 a year to keep the life insurance policy active. Well, the children, they went ahead and dipped into her trust anyway, taking $25,000 a year out to pay for this life insurance policy, and all that really did was increase the value of the life insurance policy that they were to receive upon her death. So it was a way of funneling money away from her. These are just some of the ways where the monies went. Absolutely, some of the money went to Celeste because we had the court's authority, and that was the purpose of the trust, was to spend the money on Celeste every month. So it was going to her credit card bills, but we were using the money. Unfortunately, we had to use that money that we were getting every month to pay the lawyers.
Is there any chance that the house might be lost now?
Well, yes, there's a chance. And it's an unfortunate chance because it's a circumstance that was completely avoidable, and it was structured by the lawyers themselves. They did not protect Celeste the way they were hired to do so. And they didn't protect her because they, quite frankly, drafted in the settlement a provision that protected their interest, and if they so wanted to insist on getting paid, they could try to force the sale of the apartment in order just to pay their outstanding legal fees. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's interesting to know.
Okay, so and the son could try as a trustee to force the sale, but again, it would just go to disclosing and proving what his intentions had been all along. That's why I said 4 months ago. What happened? Let me tell you what happened 4 months ago and why there was an 5 months ago, February, March, I guess you added up. We had part of the settlement was to provide for Celeste the provision that the co-op, if there was no money in the trust, that the apartment